The Browns might have just revealed their real plan, and almost nobody noticed it. Because when the conversation turned to the number 6 pick, everyone expected one thing: a quarterback. There was talk about names like Ty Simpson, speculation about the future, and a clear sense that Cleveland needed to make a decision. But then something unexpected happened. They didn't take a QB. Instead, they went in a completely different direction. And that decision, it raised more questions than answers. Because in a moment where most teams would try to secure their future, the Browns chose patience. They chose something else entirely. So now the real question is, did they just pass on their next quarterback? Or did they quietly show us their actual plan? Before the pick was even made, the conversation was already heading in one direction. Quarterback. That was the expectation. That was the focus. Because when you're sitting at pick number 6, and your long-term situation isn't fully locked in, people naturally start looking at QBs. And in this case, one name kept coming up: Ty Simpson. There was real discussion around him, real consideration, the kind of conversation that suggests a team is at least thinking about the future. Because that's what the draft is about, right? Planning ahead, securing your next leader before you desperately need one. And for a moment, it felt like that's exactly where this was going. Because the way people were talking, it wasn't just a random idea. It was a legitimate option, a path the Browns could have taken. Now here where it gets interesting. Even within that discussion, there wasn't full agreement. Some people believed Simpson was the guy. Others weren't completely sold. There were questions about fit, about readiness, about whether he was truly worth that kind of investment at that spot. And that hesitation, that matters. Because when a team is completely convinced about a quarterback, you don't hear that kind of uncertainty. You don't hear debate. You hear conviction, clear direction, strong belief. But here, it felt different, more open-ended, more cautious, like the idea was being explored, but not fully embraced. And that tells you something important, because it suggests the Browns weren't desperate. They weren't locked into forcing a quarterback pick. They were evaluating, weighing options, looking at the bigger picture. Now think about what that means. Because when a team needs a quarterback, they don't hesitate. They act. They secure the position. They make sure the future is defined. But when a team chooses to pause, to consider, to potentially pass on that option entirely, that's intentional. That's strategy. Because it means they believe they have other paths, other ways to build, other ways to solve the problem. And that's exactly what makes this moment so important. Because going into the pick, everything pointed toward a quarterback conversation. But by the time it was over, that conversation had completely shifted. And what they chose to do instead, that's where things really start to get interesting. And this is where everything flipped. Because after all the talk, all the speculation, all the focus on quarterbacks, the Browns didn't go in that direction at all. Instead, they made a move that caught a lot of people off guard. They took a wide receiver, Cardell Tate. Now on paper, it's a strong pick. There's talent, there's production, there's real upside. But that's not what made this decision so interesting. It's what the pick represents. Because in that moment, the Browns had a choice: address the future at quarterback, or build around what they already have. And they chose the second option. Now listen to how the pick was described. Smooth, productive, always finds a way to get open. Those aren't just compliments. That's a profile. A player who makes life easier for a quarterback. And that detail matters more than anything. Because instead of trying to solve the quarterback question directly, they're trying to improve the environment around it. Now think about that shift. Because most teams in this position would panic. They'd reach for a quarterback. They'd try to force the answer. But Cleveland didn't do that. They stayed disciplined. They stayed focused on value. And more importantly, they stayed committed to a plan. Because choosing a receiver here isn't random. It's strategic. It's saying, we're not rushing this. We're building first. And that tells you something important about how they see their current situation. Because if they truly believed they had no answer at quarterback, they wouldn't pass on the position. Not at pick 6. Not with that kind of opportunity. But they did. Which suggests something else. Either they have more confidence in their current room than people realize, or they believe the right answer isn't in this moment. And that's a big statement. Because now, instead of solving the problem immediately, they're extending the timeline, giving themselves more flexibility, more time to evaluate, more time to see what they actually have. And that's where this becomes more than just a draft pick. Because this decision doesn't just impact the roster. It reshapes the entire conversation. Because now the question isn't just who's the quarterback. It's what are the Browns really building here? And once you start looking at it that way, the strategy starts to become a lot clearer. But here, where it gets even more interesting. Because this decision doesn't just say something about the roster. It says something about what they believe internally. And this is where the decision starts to reveal something deeper. Because passing on a quarterback at pick number 6 isn't just about the draft. It's about belief. Because when a team chooses not to take a QB in a moment like that, they're telling you something, even if they don't say it out loud. Because think about the situation. There was already discussion about the future. Names like Ty Simpson were being brought up. The idea was clearly on the table. So it's not like the Browns ignored the quarterback position. They considered it. They evaluated it. They talked about it. And then they chose not to act on it. Now that decision can mean a few different things. First, it could suggest confidence. Confidence in the current quarterback room. Confidence that they already have someone who can lead the team. Or at least someone worth giving more time to. Because if you truly believed your current situation wasn't good enough, you don't pass on that opportunity. Not that early in the draft. But there's another possibility. And this is where things get interesting. It could also mean uncertainty. Not panic, but patience. Because sometimes, teams don't avoid a position because they're confident. They avoid it because they're not fully convinced by the options available. And that's a key difference. Because in that case, the decision isn't about what you have. It's about what you don't see. Maybe they didn't view this quarterback class as strong enough. Maybe they didn't believe the value matched the pick. Maybe they didn't see a clear upgrade. And if that's the case, then passing on a QB isn't risky. It's calculated. Now here's the important part. We don't have confirmation of which direction this leans. No official statement. No clear answer. So anything beyond that becomes interpretation. But even without confirmation, the action itself speaks. Because teams don't pass on quarterbacks lightly, especially when the conversation is already happening. especially when the need is being discussed publicly. So whether it's confidence, or patience, or a combination of both, one thing is clear. The Browns didn't feel pressured. They didn't force the decision. And that alone tells you a lot. Because in the NFL, pressure leads to mistakes, rushed decisions, reaching for answers that aren't really there. But this feels controlled, measured, intentional. And that's what makes it so important. Because now, instead of locking themselves into a direction, they've kept everything open. Every possibility, every outcome. And that gives them something most teams don't have: flexibility. But here, where it goes even deeper. Because if they're not solving the quarterback position directly, then what exactly are they building instead? And this is where the strategy becomes crystal clear. Because if the Browns didn't draft a quarterback, then what did they actually prioritize? The answer is simple: support. Because by selecting a weapon like Shedeur Tate at number 6, they're not ignoring the quarterback position. They're reinforcing it. And that's a completely different approach. Because instead of asking, who replaces the quarterback, they're asking, how do we make the quarterback better? Now think about that shift. Because in today's NFL, we've seen this model work. Teams don't always fix QB problems by replacing the QB. Sometimes, they fix it by improving everything around him. Better weapons, better spacing, better opportunities to succeed. And that's exactly what this looks like. Because Shedeur Tate isn't just another receiver. He's described as smooth, reliable, consistently creating separation. Those are traits that directly help a quarterback. Because now throws become easier, reads become clearer, mistakes become less costly. And that changes everything. Now, instead of forcing perfect execution, you're creating margin for error. And that's how offenses take the next step. Now here's the key detail most people miss. This approach requires patience. Because it doesn't give you instant answers. It doesn't create headlines like "New Franchise QB." Instead, it builds quietly, gradually, until suddenly everything starts working. And that's what makes this decision so interesting. Because it suggests the Browns aren't chasing quick fixes. They're building structure, a system, an environment where any quarterback, current or future, can succeed. And that's powerful. Because once that environment is in place, the quarterback position becomes easier to evaluate, easier to manage, easier to upgrade if needed. But until then, you're guessing, and maybe that's what they're trying to avoid. Now, to be fair, not everyone agrees with this approach. Some believe you should always prioritize the quarterback first, lock in the most important position, and figure everything else out later. And that's a valid argument. Because if you don't have the right QB, nothing else really matters. But the Browns, they're taking a different route. They're saying, let's build the system first. Let's make sure the situation is right. Then we'll figure out the rest. And that's a bold move. Because it doesn't guarantee success. But it does give you control. Control over development. Control over evaluation. Control over timing. And that might be the most important part. Because now, they're not reacting to pressure. They're dictating the process. But here, where things get risky. Because if this plan doesn't work, the criticism is going to come fast. And this is where the entire strategy gets tested. Because while building around the quarterback sounds smart, it also comes with a serious risk. Because if it works, it looks like a master plan. But if it does, it gets questioned immediately. Because passing on a quarterback at pick number 6 is not something people forget, especially if the position continues to struggle. And that's the reality the Browns are walking into right now. Because by choosing not to draft a QB, they've essentially made a bet. A bet that their current situation can improve. A bet that adding weapons will make the difference. A bet that patience will pay off. But bets like that don't come without pressure. Because the moment things don't go right, the narrative flips. Fast. Fans start asking questions. Why didn't we take a quarterback? Why did we pass on that opportunity? Did we miss our chance? And once those questions start building, they don't go away easily. Now here's the key part. This isn't just about results. It's about expectations. Because when a team makes a bold decision like this, they raise the stakes. They create a standard. And anything below that standard feels like failure, even if the plan is still developing. Now add in the fact that other teams around the league are constantly searching for quarterbacks, constantly investing in the position. And it makes this decision stand out even more, because it goes against the trend. And when you go against the trend, you have to be right. Because if you're not, it becomes a talking point, a headline, a decision that gets replayed over and over again. Now, to be fair, there's still time. This isn't a final judgment. The season hasn't played out yet. The full plan hasn't revealed itself. So everything we're talking about is still in that wait and see phase. But that doesn't remove the risk, because the risk is already there. It's built into the decision. And that's what makes this moment so important. Because from here on out, every performance matters. Every game matters. Every sign of progress, or lack of it, gets connected back to this choice. But here, where it gets even more interesting. Because while this move might feel risky in isolation, when you zoom out and look at the league as a whole, it actually fits into a much bigger trend. And this is where the bigger picture starts to come into focus. Because what the Browns are doing right now, it might not be as unusual as it seems. In fact, it's starting to look like part of a growing trend across the league. Because more and more teams are shifting their approach. Instead of immediately replacing quarterbacks, they're building around them first. Adding weapons, improving protection, creating systems that elevate performance, and only then, making a final decision at the position. Now think about why that's happening. Because the quarterback position has changed. It's no longer just about raw talent. It's about situation, fit, support. And we've seen what happens when a quarterback is thrown into a bad environment. Even talented players struggle. Even high draft picks fail. Not because they weren't good enough, but because the system around them wasn't ready. And teams are starting to learn from that. Now, instead of rushing the process, they're slowing it down, building the foundation first, making sure everything else is in place, so that when the quarterback steps in, they have a real chance to succeed. And that's exactly what Cleveland's move looks like. Because by taking a player like Cardell Tate, they're not just adding talent, they're strengthening the structure of the offense. They're making it easier for whoever lines up under center. Now here's the interesting part. Other teams in the same draft are doing similar things. Focusing on weapons, focusing on defense, focusing on versatility. Because the league is evolving. It's becoming less about one position and more about how everything works together. But here, where Cleveland's situation still stands out. Because while other teams are building around established quarterbacks, the Browns are doing it while their situation is still uncertain. And that's a key difference, because it adds another layer of pressure, another layer of risk. Because now they're not just building, they're building while still searching for clarity. And that's not easy, because it requires patience, confidence, and a willingness to trust the process without immediate results. But if it works, it changes everything. Because now, instead of forcing a quarterback into a weak system, they'll have a strong system ready. A situation where success becomes more likely, more sustainable. And that's the upside. But here, the final piece of this entire strategy. Because when you combine everything, the pick, the timing, the trend, and the risk, it starts to reveal something bigger. Something that goes beyond just this one decision. And this is where everything finally starts to connect. Because when you take a step back and look at the full picture, the decision not to draft a quarterback, the choice to add a weapon instead, the patience, the timing, it all points toward one thing: a plan, not confusion, not hesitation, a plan. Because what the Browns are doing right now isn't random. It's controlled. They're not rushing to define their quarterback situation. They're allowing it to reveal itself. And that's a very different approach. Because most teams try to force answers. They pick a quarterback early. They commit. They build everything around that decision. But Cleveland, they're doing the opposite. They're building the system first, then letting the quarterback situation sort itself out within that system. Now think about how powerful that can be. Because instead of guessing who the right quarterback is, they're creating an environment where the right quarterback becomes obvious. Through performance, through consistency, through actual results. And that removes a lot of risk. Because now, the decision isn't based on projection. It's based on reality. Now here's the interesting part. This approach also keeps their options open. Because they're not locked into one path. They haven't committed to a single solution. They haven't closed any doors. If their current quarterbacks step up, great. They already have the system in place. If they do, they can still go after someone later. Through the draft, through a trade, through free agency. And now that player would be stepping into a much better situation. And that flexibility, that's what makes this strategy so valuable. Because in the NFL, things change fast. Injuries happen. Performance fluctuates. Situations evolve. And teams that stay flexible, teams that don't lock themselves into one outcome, they're the ones that adapt the fastest. And that's exactly what this looks like. Adaptability, preparation, control. Now, does this guarantee success? No, because at some point, you still need the right quarterback. There's no way around that. But what this does guarantee is that when that moment comes, they'll be ready. Because they've already built everything else. And that changes the equation completely. Because now, instead of asking, can the quarterback carry the team? They'll be asking, can the quarterback fit into what we've built? And that's a much easier question to answer. But now everything comes down to one final thing. Because once the season starts, once the games begin, this entire plan is going to be tested. And now everything comes down to what happens next. Because the Browns didn't just make a draft pick. They made a statement. A statement about patience, about control, about how they believe a team should be built. Because instead of forcing a quarterback decision, they chose to wait. Instead of chasing certainty, they chose flexibility. And instead of following the obvious path, they created their own. Now the big question is, was that the right move? Because on one side, the logic is clear. Build the system first. Add weapons. Create an environment where success is possible. Then let the quarterback situation reveal itself naturally. That's smart. That's controlled. That's how sustainable teams are built. But on the other side, there's risk. Because in the NFL, the quarterback position isn't optional. At some point, you have to find the answer. You can't delay it forever. And by passing on that opportunity at pick number 6, they've put pressure on everything else to work. Because if the current situation improves, this decision looks brilliant. If it does, it becomes the moment everyone points back to. The what-if moment. The missed opportunity. And that's what makes this so interesting. Because right now, we're in the middle. Nothing has been proven yet. Nothing has been decided. Everything is still unfolding. But one thing is certain. This wasn't a random decision. This was intentional, calculated, part of a bigger plan. So now the real question isn't just about the draft anymore. It's about the future. Because if this strategy works, the Browns didn't just make a good pick. They changed how their entire team is built. But if it does, then this might be remembered as the moment they passed on their answer. So now it's your turn. Did the Browns make the smart move? Or did they just miss their biggest opportunity?